The gun was already drawn before August Lockhart even made it through the gate. Violet Hayes stood on the porch of the most weather-beaten farmhouse in Crockett County, Texas, her dark hair loose and wild around her shoulders, her eyes burning with something that had long since moved past grief and arrived at something far more dangerous. She was thin, too thin. The kind of thin that made a man's chest lock up when he looked at it, the kind that told a story of weeks, maybe months, of slow self-destruction. Her dress hung off her like it belonged to a woman twice her size, which, August suspected, it once had. She'd wasted herself down to nearly nothing, and she was pointing an 1873 Colt single-action Army revolver directly at his badge. "You are on private property, Sheriff," she said, and her voice was steady in a way that made it worse somehow. A trembling woman with a gun could be talked down. A steady one was a different kind of problem entirely. August Lockhart did not reach for his own weapon. He was 32 years old, broad-shouldered, built like a man who had never once in his life turned away from hard work, with dark eyes that had seen enough of the frontier to know when force was the wrong currency. He kept his hands visible and his feet planted just inside the gate. "Miss Hayes," he said. "I will count to 3, she told him. "I know you will, and then I will shoot." "I know that too," he didn't move. "But I'm not leaving." The wind pulled at the dry grass around them, sending a small funnel of dust spinning across the yard. It was October of 1882, and the Texas sun was already low enough to cut sideways and brutal across the flat land, throwing long shadows from the fence posts. The nearest neighbor was 4 miles west. The nearest town, Redrock, was 8 miles east. August had ridden all 8 of them alone, which meant nobody was coming to help either of them. Violet's jaw tightened. "Why not?" "Because you haven't eaten in 3 days, maybe 4. And I'm not a man who rides away from something like that." Something cracked in her expression, not much, just a hairline fracture in that terrible steadiness. But August had been watching people's faces his entire adult life, and he caught it the way a good hunter catches the first movement of prey in tall grass. He took 1 step forward. "Don't," she warned. "I brought food," he said. "It's in the saddlebag, nothing fancy. Some salt pork, cornbread, a tin of peaches. I'm going to tie my horse to that post there, and then I'm going to sit down on your porch steps and wait until you're ready to eat. I don't need your charity." "It's not charity, it's stubbornness." He took another step. "I'm told I'm famous for it." She kept the gun up. He kept walking, slow and deliberate, until he reached his horse at the gate and began loosening the saddlebag. The revolver followed him the whole way. He pretended not to notice. That was how it began. Not with a declaration or a tender moment, but with a standoff on a dying farm in South Texas. A woman with a gun and a man with cornbread, and something that was either extraordinary foolishness or extraordinary faith in what the human heart could survive. To understand how they had arrived at this particular moment on this particular porch, you had to go back 6 weeks, to the day August Lockhart first heard the name Violet Hayes. He had been in his office in Redrock, a town that had sprung up along the Southern Pacific Rail line like most towns out here had, fast and optimistic and already fraying at the edges, when his deputy, a young man named Cord Macy, had pushed open the door without knocking, which Cord always did and which August had given up correcting. "You hear about the Hayes property?" Cord asked, dropping himself into the chair across from August's desk with the unself-conscious ease of a 22-year-old, who had never once worried about his own physical comfort. August had been reading a letter from the county seat regarding a disputed cattle boundary, which was exactly the kind of paperwork that made him miss his simpler years. "What about it?" "Old Martin Hayes died 6 weeks ago. His daughter's out there alone. People in town are saying she's not doing well." August set down the letter. "What kind of not doing well?" "Emmett Corder over at the general store says she came in about 3 weeks ago, bought flour and coffee, looked like a walking ghost. Said she'd lost considerable weight. He tried to ask after her and she near bit his head off." Cord paused. "No one's seen her since." August had known Martin Hayes not well but enough. The man had been a quiet, private, deeply stubborn widower, who had run his 300 acres with his daughter's help for going on 15 years, ever since his wife Alina had died of fever. Martin Hayes had been 64 when he passed, which the town doctor had confirmed was a straightforward heart failure, and he had left behind exactly one heir, Violet Hayes, age 28, who had never married, who had rarely come to town, and who, by all available evidence, had poured her entire existence into that farm and into caring for a father who needed her. August had stood up from his desk. "I'll ride out," he said. Cord had blinked. "You sure that's the sheriff's business? She's not breaking any laws. Dying of grief and starvation on a remote property is going to become the sheriff's business eventually," August said, reaching for his hat. "I'd rather it be sooner." That first visit had not gone the way he expected, which was to say it had gone considerably worse. He'd arrived at the Hayes property to find the fence gate tied shut with wire, a hand-lettered sign nailed to the post that read "Private property, no visitors," and Violet Hayes nowhere in sight. He had called out from the gate, gotten no answer, and made the tactical decision to respect the sign. He was not, however, a man who simply accepted defeat. He rode back to Redrock and started asking questions with the particular patience of someone who had learned that most secrets in a small town were only secrets to people who hadn't asked the right person yet. What he learned in the next 2 weeks came in fragments, the way truth usually did. Violet Hayes had been her father's entire support system for 15 years. She had cooked every meal, managed the household accounts, helped with the cattle work, nursed him through 2 bad winters and a bout of lung trouble 3 years prior. She had turned down at least 2 proposals of marriage that people in Redrock knew about, though there were likely more, because accepting meant leaving the farm and leaving her father, and she would not do that. She had no close friends, not because she was unkind, but because the farm and her father had taken everything she had, and there was nothing left over to build friendship from. The few women in town who had tried to befriend her had eventually given up, not from malice, but from the exhaustion of always being the one doing the reaching. Her mother's death, which August heard about from the Reverend Giles at the small Methodist church on Redrock's Main Street, had been particularly devastating because Violet had been 13 at the time and had, by all accounts, simply absorbed her mother's role in the household with a practicality that the Reverend described as heartbreaking to witness. A 13-year-old girl making biscuits at 4 in the morning and keeping account books and telling her father everything would be all right. "She's never known how to need anything for herself," the Reverend told August, folding his hands on his desk in the way men of God did when they were trying to frame something painful as instructive. "She's only ever known how to be needed." August had sat with that for a long time. He understood something about that particular wound. He had grown up with a father who had died in the war before August was old enough to remember him, a mother who had worked herself to the bone to raise him and his 2 younger sisters in a way that left no room for August to be anything other than useful and capable. He had become a lawman not entirely out of noble motivation, though there was some of that, but also because it gave him a clear and constant way to be necessary, to be the person other people needed. He recognized in Violet Hayes a kind of mirror of something he had spent years trying to understand in himself, and that recognition bothered him more than he thought it should, given that he had never actually spoken to the woman. The second time he rode out to the Hayes property, which was in the 3rd week after Cord's initial report, he made it through the gate, got as far as the porch before she came to the door, and managed to introduce himself before she told him to leave with a politeness so rigid it was more insulting than a curse would have been. "I'm August Lockhart, Sheriff of Crockett County," he said. "I know who you are," she said. "I'd like you to leave." She was pale. Her cheekbones were too prominent. But her eyes were extraordinary, a deep and complicated gray that caught the afternoon light and turned it into something more interesting than the flat landscape around them deserved. "I just wanted to check in," he said. "People in town are concerned. People in town enjoy other people's business, she said. I'm not their business and I'm not yours. You might be, he said carefully, if things get much worse. Something moved across her face. I'm fine, she said. You don't look fine. She closed the door. He rode back to Raydrock and spent a sleepless night trying to decide if he was overstepping, if he was projecting something onto a stranger that wasn't there, if he was manufacturing a reason to be concerned, because he was, if he was being honest with himself, genuinely and inexplicably drawn to a woman he barely knew. By morning he had decided it didn't matter why he was concerned. The concern was real regardless of its origin, and he was not a man who could look away from something real. He went back. The third visit was when she met him at the gate with the revolver. He had learned by then, from Emmett Corder at the general store, that Violet had not purchased food in 3 weeks. He had confirmed with the farm's only other occasional contact, a Mexican vaquero named Felipe who sometimes bought hay from the Hayes property, that Felipe had ridden by a week prior and seen no smoke from the farmhouse chimney, which out here in late autumn meant either no fire or no cooking. He had put the 2 pieces of information together and arrived at a conclusion that scared him in a way he hadn't been scared since his first year as a deputy, when he was young enough that fear still had the decency to surprise him. She wasn't just grieving, she was disappearing. Not with dramatic intention, but with the slow, stubborn passivity of someone who had simply forgotten to exist for herself, who had spent so many years fueling a household that when the household ended, she didn't know how to fuel herself anymore. So he packed the saddlebag with food, rode 8 miles, found her waiting with a loaded gun, and refused to leave. I can keep this up for a long time, August said, settling himself onto the bottom porch step with the deliberately casual ease of a man who had nowhere else to be, which was not entirely untrue. The sun was nearly down now, pulling the temperature with it. He unwrapped the cornbread from its cloth and set it on the step beside him. I've slept in worse places than a porch yard. I did 3 months once in a canvas tent in a New Mexico winter. Violet stood inside the doorway. She had put the revolver away somewhere in the last 10 minutes, which he considered progress. You cannot camp on my property, she said. I'm not camping, he said. I'm just not leaving. That is the same thing. Philosophically, maybe. She made a sound that might, under different circumstances, have been the beginning of a laugh. August filed that away with great care. This is not your responsibility, she said, and there it was, the first crack in the wall where something real came through because her voice changed on the word responsibility, went quieter, more careful, like she just said something she hadn't meant to. Probably not, he agreed. But I'm here anyway. Why? He looked up at her from the step. The last red light of the sunset was behind him, which meant she was probably squinting to see him clearly, which was not ideal but would have to do. Because nobody should be in this much pain alone, he said. And because I think you've been alone in your pain for such a long time you've convinced yourself it's the natural order of things. Silence. Then, you don't know me. Not yet, he said. She stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then she disappeared inside without a word. August turned back to the yard, the darkness settling in around him, the coyotes beginning their distant, mournful conversation with the stars. He reached into the saddlebag and took out a piece of salt pork and ate it slowly, because he was genuinely hungry from the ride, and because he was settling in for what his instincts told him might be a very long night. The lamp in the farmhouse window came on about an hour after dark. Then, close to 9 o'clock by his estimation, the door opened and Violet Hayes stepped out with a blanket over her shoulders and sat down on the far end of the porch, as far from him as the porch allowed. He didn't say anything, she didn't say anything. After a while she said, "What kind of cornbread?" "Plain," he said. "I don't have access to a kitchen that does it any other way. Mrs. Delgado at the hotel says she'll make it fancy if I ask, but I never remember to ask until I'm already eating." Another silence. "My mother used to make it with honey," Violet said. "She'd crack open the comb right over the skillet." "That sounds considerably better than what I have," August said. It was. Her voice had gone somewhere far away. I used to help her. I was probably in the way more than I was helping, but she let me stand on a stool and pour the honey." He waited. The coyotes kept talking. "I used to make it for my father," she said. "The plain version without the honey. He didn't like sweet cornbread after she died, said it reminded him too much." She stopped. "I suppose I understand that now." August didn't offer any wisdom about grief. He'd noticed over the years that people in grief rarely needed wisdom. They needed someone to be still with them in the dark. "Will you eat something?" he asked finally, just that. No argument behind it, a very long pause. "One piece," she said. He handed her the cornbread without making it into anything more than what it was, without looking at her with the particular expression of triumph or pity that he suspected she would have thrown right back at him. She ate it slowly, which told him her stomach had shrunk, which told him this had been going on longer than 3 days, possibly much longer. When she was done, she stood up and went back inside. "I'll be back in the morning," he said. "I'll still have the gun," she said. "I'll still have breakfast," he said. He rode back to Redrock in the full dark, and he thought about her the entire 8 miles. The way she held herself, that ramrod posture that looked like strength from a distance and up close looked like the only thing keeping her upright. The way she spoke, precise and careful and occasionally punctuated by something quick and sharp that suggested a mind that was moving faster than she was willing to let show. The extraordinary gray eyes, the honey cornbread memory and what it cost her to say it. He was in serious trouble, and he knew it. He went back the next morning, and the morning after that. The gun was out again on the second morning, which he found oddly reassuring. A woman who had given up entirely did not come to the gate armed. She came to eat the breakfast without argument, which she did, sitting on the far end of the porch while he sat on the step, and they maintained a careful, negotiated distance that he thought suited them both at this particular stage of whatever this was. By the 4th visit, she was no longer bringing the gun to the door, though he suspected it remained within reach somewhere in the house. By the 5th visit, she sat closer on the porch. Still not close, but closer. By the 7th visit, which was 8 days into the process, she asked him how he had become sheriff. He told her the honest version, not the flattened official version he gave at civic meetings. He told her about growing up in a small town in central Texas with a widowed mother who ran a boarding house and 2 younger sisters who terrified him considerably more than any criminal he had since encountered. He told her about his first job as a deputy at 21 in a town called Garnet, which no longer existed, having been literally erased by a flood the following year, and how that erasure had struck him as a specific metaphor for something, but he had never worked out what. He told her about the 2 years he had spent tracking a man named Conrad Bates who had been running a stolen cattle operation through 4 counties, which had been the most exhausting 2 years of his professional life, and about the moment he had cornered Bates in a dry creek bed in Pecos County, and Bates had looked at him and said, with genuine curiosity, "How did you find me?" "What did you tell him?" Violet asked. "I told him I just kept going," August said, "because it was the truth. I don't have any secret gift for detection, I just don't stop." She looked at him for a moment with those gray eyes. "No," she said, "you don't." It was the first time she had looked at him like that, with something that was not wariness or irritation or grief, but something that was possibly the very early, fragile beginning of recognition. He kept coming back. On the 10th day, she made the coffee. He arrived in the morning to find a tin cup on the porch railing, steam rising from it, and Violet inside the screen door watching to see what he would do with it. He took the cup, sat down on the step, and drank the coffee, which was strong enough to float a horseshoe, which was how he liked it. "Thank you," he said. "Don't make it into something it's not," she said. "It's coffee," he said. "I'm just grateful for the coffee." She came out and sat in the rocking chair at the end of the porch, which was a different location than her usual far-end seat, which meant she was 3 feet closer than she had been the day before. He noted this without comment. They talked about the farm. She talked about it differently than most people talked about their land. She didn't talk about it as property or investment or legacy. She talked about it the way you talked about a relationship, with a complicated mixture of love and frustration and the particular exhaustion of something you had given too much to for too long. "The east fence needs new posts," she said. "Probably 20 of them. The wood rotted through over last winter and my father kept saying he'd get to it and then he didn't and now it's my problem." She stopped. "Not that I have cattle to contain anymore. I sold the last of them 6 weeks ago." "After your father passed." "A week before." She said it flatly, and he heard the hidden weight under the flatness. "He was too ill to manage them and I couldn't do it alone. We sold to the Corder operation, which my father hated. He and Warren Corder had a dispute about water rights in 1875 that never entirely resolved itself." She paused. "He would have hated that I sold to Warren's son, but it was the only offer." August understood, without her saying it, that the sale of the cattle had been one of the final surrenders, the acknowledgement in practical, irreversible terms that the farm as it had been was over, that the life as it had been was over. "What do you want to do with the property?" he asked. He kept his voice neutral, because this was clearly a question that had sharp edges, and he had no intention of pushing her toward any particular answer. It was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know," she finally said, and the honesty of it seemed to surprise her. "I've been here my entire life. I don't know what I want that doesn't include this place." "That's all right," he said. "You don't have to know yet." "Everybody seems to think I should sell and go somewhere," she said, with a new edge in her voice. "Go where? Go to what? I have no family except a second cousin in Georgia I've never met. I have no training for anything beyond what I've done here." "You have considerable training," August said. "For what? Farming. I can't run a farm alone." "You could," he said carefully, "but that's not what I meant. You've been running a household, managing accounts, making medical decisions, doing physical labor, and keeping another person alive through grief and illness for 15 years. That's not a narrow skill set, Miss Hayes." She looked at him. "You make it sound impressive." "It is impressive." She looked away. "It doesn't feel impressive, it just feels like what I did." "Most impressive things feel that way from the inside," he said. The silence that followed was different from the earlier silences. It was warmer, less defended. Violet reached for her coffee cup and he noticed, not for the first time, her hands. They were a working woman's hands, capable and scarred by 100 small farm accidents, and they were shaking slightly, which he suspected was partly hunger and partly something deeper. He had been watching her eat over the last 10 days with the focused attention of a man conducting a careful study in what recovered means, not the dramatic Hollywood notion of restored in a single moment, but the real thing, which was slow and irregular and sometimes went backward. She was eating more. Not enough, but more. The hollows under her cheekbones were slightly less pronounced. She had brushed her hair before he arrived this morning, which she hadn't done the first 3 days. These were small things. August collected them all. "My father used to say," Violet said, apparently to the middle distance, "that the worst thing about grief is that it makes you selfish. Not in the way people mean it. He didn't mean self-centered. He meant that grief collapses everything down to one point, to the loss, and you can't see past the edge of it. Everything outside the grief stops feeling real." "He sounds like he thought carefully about things," August said. "He did." She set down the coffee cup. "He also said that the way out of grief was always through something practical. He said you couldn't think your way out of grief, you had to do your way out. Fix a fence post, bake the bread, mend the harness." She was quiet. "I stopped doing the practical things." "You're doing them again." She looked at him sharply. "I'm eating breakfast with a sheriff who refuses to leave my property. That's not exactly what he meant." "It's practical," August said. "It's also requiring you to talk, which is probably something your father would have approved of." She made the sound again, the one that was almost a laugh, and this time he was close enough to see what it did to her face, the brief, involuntary softening of all those carefully held defenses. He wanted very badly to see her actually laugh. That night, riding back to Reed Rock, he tried to take honest account of what was happening and what he intended to do about it. He was falling for Violet Hayes with a thoroughness that was, professionally speaking, almost certainly inappropriate. He was visiting her property daily on no official mandate whatsoever. He was bringing her food. He was listening to her talk about her dead father with an attention and tenderness he could not entirely justify as professional concern. He was also fairly certain she was beginning to fall for him, which made the whole situation simultaneously better and considerably more complicated, because she was still raw with grief and still physically fragile, and she had spent her entire adult life learning to need nothing and nobody, and he would have to be very careful not to rush something that needed time the way a healing bone needed time. He went back on day 11, and day 12, and day 13. On day 13, she invited him inside. It was a small thing and a large thing simultaneously. She stood at the door and said, with her characteristic directness, "There's no reason to sit outside in the cold when there's a table." And then she turned and went inside, which he interpreted correctly as the only invitation he was going to get. The inside of the farmhouse was clean and spare, and held the particular quality of a space that had been kept meticulously out of duty rather than joy. Everything was where it should be, and nothing was where it was because it made someone happy. There was a braided rug on the wooden floor, plain and serviceable. There was a fireplace with a modest fire. There was a table with 4 chairs, which struck him with a particular sadness. 4 chairs for a life that had been, for a long time, only 2 people. She had made biscuits. Not the elaborate honey cornbread of her mother's recipe. Plain biscuits, but properly made, which told him she had been cooking, which told him something in her had made a decision he hadn't witnessed. He sat down, and she set a plate in front of him and poured coffee, and then sat down herself on the opposite side of the table, and they had breakfast inside together, which was the most intimate thing that had happened between them, and which August treated with the same careful neutrality he had been applying to all of it, because he understood that intimacy with someone who had been in survival mode required patience the way wild things required patience. You could not rush them toward trust. You could only be consistently present and let them come to it. "I rode the fence line yesterday," she said, spreading a biscuit with a thin layer of butter. "The east section. And, you're right. 20 posts at minimum, probably closer to 25. He didn't point out that she hadn't been in a condition to ride the fence line 2 weeks ago. "Do you have the money for the lumber?" he asked. She hesitated. "Some. The cattle sale was better than I expected. There's a lumber supply that comes through Raydrock from the rail shipment every second Tuesday," he said. "I could check what they have." She looked at him with an expression that was not quite suspicious and not quite moved. It occupied the space between those 2 things. "You do not have to do that." "I know I don't," he said. "You keep doing things you don't have to do. It seems to be a habit," he said. She looked at him for a long moment, long enough that he made himself meet her gaze and hold it, because this was one of those moments where looking away would mean something he didn't want it to mean. "Who was she?" Violet asked. He blinked. "I'm sorry. The woman who made you this way. The way you take care of people without being asked, without making it into anything." She tilted her head slightly. "Someone made you like that, or something happened that did." He was surprised, not by the question, which was a perceptive one, but by how quickly she had gotten there. He was better at reading other people than most, but he was used to being the one doing the reading. "My mother," he said. "Not that she made me that way directly. More that I watched her take care of everyone around her, and I watched how alone that left her, and I decided very young that if someone near me needed something and I could provide it, I would." "That's a very practical way of describing love," she said. The word landed between them on the table, and neither of them immediately picked it up. "It is," he finally said. She looked down at her biscuit. "My mother was the same way. She gave everything to this farm and to my father and to me, and she was gone at 41, and I've spent a long time being angry at her for that, which I know isn't fair." "Anger at the dead rarely requires fairness," August said. "My father used to say that," she said quietly. In so many words, she picked at the edge of the biscuit. "I'm angry at him too, for leaving. I know he didn't choose it. I know his heart simply stopped the way hearts do. but I'm angry that he left me here alone with all of this and no instruction on what to do next." "What do you want to do next?" August asked, not pressing, just asking. She looked up. "I want to fix the fence," she said. "I want to get a few head of cattle in the spring, not the full herd, just enough to manage alone or nearly alone." She paused. "I want to learn how to cook the honey cornbread the way my mother made it. I think there's a recipe somewhere in her things." "Those are good things to want," he said. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't entirely parse, something layered and careful and new. "What do you want?" she asked. Not as the sheriff, as a person. Nobody had asked him that in a long time. He sat with it honestly for a moment. "I want to stop being useful as a substitute for being known," he said. He hadn't planned to say it that way. It came out with more precision than he intended, too much honesty for a breakfast table. But she nodded slowly, as if he'd confirmed something she'd already suspected. "We have that in common," she said. He stayed longer than usual that morning. They talked about things that had nothing to do with grief or survival, about the Crockett County elections in the spring, about a book she had been reading, a worn copy of Jane Eyre that sat on the windowsill and that she had apparently read 4 times, about the particular character of the Texas sky in October, and how it was different from the summer sky in a way that was hard to articulate, but she thought had something to do with the light arriving at a different angle. When he finally stood to leave, she walked him to the door, which she hadn't done before, always letting him find his own way out. "Same time tomorrow?" he asked. "You don't have to keep coming," she said. "I know that," he said. She looked at him steadily. "Same time," she said. He had ridden nearly a mile down the road before he realized he was smiling, which was not an expression he wore particularly often, and which felt strange and right at the same time, the way things did when something was genuinely new. Over the following 2 weeks the rhythm of his visits shifted. He still came daily, most days, but now there was a different quality to it. Less rescue and more simply the particular pleasure of being in a specific person's company. He brought things occasionally, not always food, though he still made sure she was eating, a newspaper when one came in on the rail, a small jar of good honey he'd traded for at the general store. The honey sat on her kitchen table the next morning and she looked at it for a long time before she looked at him. "I'm going to find that recipe," she said. "I hope so," he said. She found it 3 days later. Her mother's handwriting in a small ledger book that had been kept in the back of the bedroom wardrobe. Not a recipe ledger but an account book. And the recipe was written in the margin of a page from April of 1868, squeezed in beside the record of seed expenditures in the way that important things sometimes hid in the margins of practical documents. She told him about finding it when he arrived the following morning. She was different when she told him, animated in a way he hadn't seen before, the energy of someone who has recovered something they thought was gone forever. "The handwriting is very small," she said. She always wrote small when she was in a hurry. I think she wrote it down in a hurry because she was afraid of forgetting it and someone needed her for something. She set the ledger on the table between them. You can see where she scratched out the original honey measurement and doubled it. He looked at the margin notes. The handwriting was small and careful, and the ink had faded to a warm brown. He thought about Eleanor Hayes in 1868, writing a recipe in the margin of an account book, and felt the long, branching weight of one life's influence on another. "Will you make it?" he asked. "I already did," she said, and set a plate on the table. The cornbread was extraordinary. He was not a man given to hyperbole about food, but this was genuinely excellent, sweet and rich in a way that was somehow also perfectly balanced by the texture of the crust, which was exactly what good cornbread should be. He ate 2 pieces and told her so, and she watched him eat with an expression he was beginning to be able to read, not yet fluently, but adequately, the careful attention of someone who had given something personal and was monitoring very closely whether it was being received the way it was meant. "Your mother was an excellent cook," he said. "She was," Violet said softly. I've been carrying her recipe around in my head for 15 years, but I got it wrong somehow. Something in the proportions. The original is better. The original is always better when it comes to something like this, he said, because someone who loved making it made it. She looked at him and something shifted in her face, something deliberate and decided. August, she said. It was the first time she had used his given name. He stilled. I owe you an apology, she said. You don't, he said. I pointed a gun at you. You were frightened and I was an uninvited man on your property, he said. I understood it then, and I understand it now. You were also the first person in 6 weeks to treat me like I was still a living person rather than a problem to be managed or a property to be evaluated. She said it very carefully, the way you said things you composed in your head and wanted to get right. And I was awful to you. You were in survival mode, he said. It's a forgivable state. I want to explain something, she said, about why the gun was loaded, why I was so angry. He waited. She looked at the table for a moment, then back at him. 3 weeks before you came the first time, a man named Warren Corder came out here, the son of the man my father feuded with. He said he was coming to pay his respects, which I suppose he did in a fashion. But he also told me that the property was going to be difficult to maintain alone, that he knew of the condition of the east fence and the state of the cattle operation, and that he would be willing to purchase the land at a fair price. She paused. He was polite about it, which made it worse somehow. He came to buy the property while you were still in acute grief, August said, and heard his own voice cool. He came with documents, she said, a purchase agreement already prepared. He left it on the table. She looked away. I burned it in the fireplace after he left. Good, August said. She looked back at him, slightly startled by the flatness of his answer. You had every right to burn it, he said. You had every right to be angry, and you had every right to mistrust the next man who came through that gate without warning. That's why I had the gun, she said. When you came, I thought you might be in league with Corder somehow, that you were there to pressure me officially. He understood it completely and immediately. The hidden motive she had assumed behind his arrival, the fear that the badge was Corder's tool rather than any genuine concern. The way the timing of his visits, coming shortly after the Corder incident, would have seemed calculated from her perspective. It was never about the property, he said, not for me. I know that now, she said. How do you know it? He asked it genuinely, not to confirm anything, but because he wanted to understand what had changed for her. She was quiet for a moment. Because a man with a hidden motive brings paperwork, she said, not cornbread. He laughed. It came out of him before he could moderate it, a real laugh, and she blinked at him as if she hadn't expected it, and then the corner of her mouth curved up and the curve spread and she laughed too, just briefly, just a moment, but it was real and it was the most beautiful thing he had seen in a long time. The laughter settled into quiet, and the quiet had a different quality than any quiet they had previously shared. Warren Corder is going to come back, August said, because it needed to be said and because it was better for her to know he was thinking about it. He doesn't strike me as a man who gives up easily. No, she agreed. He doesn't. What would you like to do about that? She straightened slightly. Fix the fence, she said. Get the cattle, make the farm operational again. Make it impossible to argue that it isn't being managed. That's a practical plan, he said. My father's advice, she said. Do your way out. Would you accept help with it, he asked. Not from charity. From someone who has 2 good arms and access to lumber shipments and would genuinely like to see Warren Corder's face when he comes back and finds 25 new fence posts. She looked at him, the careful gray eyes, the face that had been gray and hollow when he first saw it and was only beginning to find its color again. Yes, she said, I would accept help with that. They began the fence work 2 days later. August arranged to take 2 personal days, which Cord Macy managed with poorly concealed curiosity and admirable restraint from direct questioning. He arrived at the Hayes property at first light with a rented wagon, the lumber, and a set of post-hole diggers he'd borrowed from the livery stable. Violet was already in the yard when he arrived. She was wearing her work clothes, which were her father's trousers cut down to fit her, belted at the waist, and a heavy cotton shirt, and she had her hair back in a practical knot, and she looked entirely different from the haunted figure in the doorway of 3 weeks ago. She still wasn't entirely recovered. You could still see it in the careful way she moved sometimes, the moments when something caught her off guard and the grief surfaced briefly through the practicality. But she was present. She was here. They worked together without awkwardness, which surprised him. He had wondered if the transition from the morning table conversations to physical shared labor would create a new strangeness between them. Instead, it seemed to work in the opposite direction. There was something about working alongside someone that stripped away the performance of conversation and showed you who they actually were. What August learned was that Violet Hayes worked with a focused, efficient competence that he found deeply attractive in the most straightforward possible way. She knew what she was doing. She didn't need instruction on how to set a post or pack the earth around it or determine the line. She made decisions quickly and changed them when the evidence suggested she'd gotten something wrong, without defensiveness or excessive deliberation. She was good at this, at all of it, and she knew she was good at it, which was different from arrogance. It was the particular confidence of someone who has earned their knowledge through experience. They worked until midday, set 14 posts, and stopped at her kitchen table for cold salt pork and cornbread because she had made more of it. "Honey version or plain?" he asked. "Honey," she said. "I used the last of what you brought." He ate it and watched her eat and noted that she was eating without having to be encouraged, which was different from the beginning, and he was glad. They went back out after lunch and worked until the light failed them, setting the remaining 11 posts and beginning to string the wire, which they would finish the following day. Riding home in the dark, August found himself in the specific state of physical tiredness combined with an unusual interior lightness that he recognized, from a distance and with some caution, as happiness. He was careful with it. He had been careful with everything regarding Violet Hayes since the beginning, because he understood what was at stake for her and did not want to be careless with it. She was a woman who had never learned to be taken care of. She was learning now, slowly and on her own terms, and he understood that how he handled the next step would matter enormously. They finished the fence the next day. In the afternoon, when the last strand of wire was stretched and tied, Violet stood back and looked at the east fence line with her hands on her hips and the particular expression of someone surveying completed work. "It's good," she said. "It's very good," he agreed from beside her. She looked sideways at him. They were standing close, closer than they usually did, a product of the proximity of the work, and she didn't step away from it. "Thank you," she said, "for all of this, not just the fence." She looked back at the fence line. "I know what you did, what you kept doing. You kept coming when every reasonable instinct should have told you to respect my very clearly stated wishes." "I'm stubborn," he said. "You're something," she said. He turned to look at her, and she was already looking at him, and the late afternoon light was doing something extraordinary to the gray of her eyes, and all the careful patience he had been maintaining made a sort of sense in this moment because it had been building to exactly this, to two people standing next to a fence they built together, looking at each other with full knowledge of what the other person was. "I'd like to court you properly," he said, "if you're willing. If it's too soon, or if you'd rather not, I understand that completely and it won't change anything. I'll still come in the mornings." She was quiet for a moment that felt very long, and then she said, "I think you've been courting me for 3 weeks." "I think so too," he said. "I just wanted to make it clear." She turned to face him fully. "I've been clear about very little lately," she said. "About everything except the fence." She looked at him with that direct, complicated gaze. "I'll be clear about this. I'd like you to keep coming in the mornings, not just as the sheriff who checks on the difficult woman on the Hayes property." "Not as that," he agreed. "As the man who likes the honey cornbread," she said, and the corner of her mouth curved. "I am extremely committed to the honey cornbread," he said. She laughed again, fuller this time, and it was everything he had hoped it would be. He began courting her formally, which in Crockett County in 1882 meant approximately the same things it meant everywhere: bringing small gifts, spending time, being present in the visible and public ways that announced an intention. He brought her a new copy of Jane Eyre, because the one she owned was held together by the particular optimism of aged binding, and she spent a long moment turning it over in her hands before setting it carefully on the windowsill next to the old one. He brought her to Raydrock one Saturday, the first time she had come to town in weeks, for the simple purpose of buying seed and hardware supplies, and he introduced her to people with a quietness that communicated clearly without announcement. Cord Macy shook her hand with the enormous enthusiasm of a 22-year-old who had been keeping secrets about his boss's daily disappearances for 3 weeks, and was clearly relieved to have the mystery resolved. Emmett Corder at the general store, who was Warren Corder's cousin but not Warren Corder, was warm and straightforward, and helped her select the seed stock with genuine knowledge and without condescension. And August watched Violet in the town with the focused interest of a man who was learning something new about a person he had only previously seen in one context. She was different in the town, but not in the way anxious people were different. She was more guarded, more watchful, less expressive. But she held herself with the same fundamental dignity she held herself with everywhere, and she spoke when spoken to with her characteristic precision, and when Mrs. Delgado from the hotel crossed the street specifically to introduce herself and tell Violet that her late mother Alina had been one of the finest women she had ever known, Violet received it with a gracious steadiness that cost her something. August could see that it cost her something, but she bore it without fracturing. In the wagon on the way back she was quiet for a while. "Your mother was clearly loved," he said. "She was," Violet said. "I forget sometimes because she's been gone so long that she had a life outside the farm, that people in town knew her and thought about her. She watched the flat land moving past. It's strange. It's a good strange." He let her have the quiet. Then she said, "Warren Corder will hear that I was in town today, with you." "Probably," he said. "He won't like it." "No," August said, "he won't." She looked at him. "Will that be a problem for you in your position?" "Warren Corder is a private citizen," August said. "He has no authority over how I conduct my personal life." "He has money," she said, "and money has a way of being its own authority." He heard the specific anxiety behind it. The fear that his involvement in her situation might create problems for him, which was also turned slightly, the fear that those problems might cause him to step back. "Violet," he said. She looked at him. "I am not going anywhere," he said. "I want to be very clear about that." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded and looked back at the road, and he felt her relax slightly beside him, the particular release of a held breath. Warren Corder came to the Hayes property 2 weeks later. August was there. He had arrived for the morning visit, and they had been at the kitchen table with coffee when the sound of hoofbeats came from the road, and Violet had gone still in the way she did when something triggered the old fear, the shuttered quality that came over her face like a door closing. August went to the window and looked out. "Warren Corder," he confirmed. Violet stood up. Her jaw was set. "Stay in here if you'd like," August said. "I'll handle it." "No," she said. "It's my property." They went out together. Corder was a large man in his middle 40s, prosperous in the way that showed in the quality of his horse and the polish of his boots, and he pulled up at the gate with the composed expression of a man who had prepared for this encounter. His expression altered when he saw August. "Sheriff Lockhart," he said. He had clearly not been prepared for this. "Mr. Corder," August said from the porch, standing beside Violet. Corder looked at Violet. "Miss Hayes, I've come to inquire after the property again. I hope you've had time to consider." "The property is not for sale," Violet said. "I understand your attachment to it," Corder said, with a particular smoothness that August recognized as the voice of someone who believed that patience was simply the slow wearing down of resistance. "But a woman alone managing 300 acres, the fence has been repaired," Violet said. "I'm purchasing cattle in the spring. The property is operational." Corder looked at August. "Sheriff, surely you can see that this is not." "What I see," August said, "is a property owner telling you her land is not for sale. That's a complete and legally sufficient answer, Mr. Corder." "I had a business arrangement with Martin Hayes regarding the water rights. Martin Hayes is deceased," August said. "His arrangements died with him unless they were contracted in writing. If you have a written contract, I'd be interested to see it. If not, I'd suggest you direct your water rights concerns to the county land office in an official capacity, and I'd suggest you do it through proper channels rather than by appearing unannounced at a private residence." Corder's composure had developed a slight crack. "I see," he said carefully. "I hope you do," August said. Corder looked at Violet one more time with an expression that was trying to communicate something between apology and warning, and then turned his horse and rode back toward the road. They watched him until the sound of hoofbeats had faded entirely. Violet let out a long breath. "He'll go to the county land office," August said. "He has lawyers." "I know," she said. "My father has or had documentation of the water rights agreement. It was verbal and there are witnesses to it who are still living." She paused. "My father was not a man who let things go undocumented after my mother died. He learned that lesson the hard way." "Good," August said. "If Corder files anything official, let me know immediately. I know the county land registrar personally." She looked at him sidelong. "You know everyone personally." "It's useful in my line of work," he said. "It's useful in general," she said. And then quietly, "Thank you for standing with me." He looked at her. The morning light was full now, coming in clear and cold from the east, and she was standing on her own porch of the farm that was hers, and she looked like herself in a way she hadn't looked the first time he'd seen her. Like a person occupying their own life rather than surviving the edges of it. "Always," he said, and meant it in a way that extended considerably beyond Warren Corder. The autumn deepened into winter. His daily visits became something the town of Raydrock accepted with the speed that small towns accepted anything that became sufficiently regular, which was to say within 2 weeks. Cord Macy began managing the morning office hours with only occasional need for August's input, which August noted was probably good professional development for the younger man and was certainly convenient for him. He and Violet talked about everything. They talked about politics, which she had opinions about that were direct and sometimes surprising, and history, and the question of what ought to be done about the situation of the Comanche and Apache peoples who had been displaced through this part of Texas, which was a subject she approached with more honesty and less comfortable rationalization than most people he knew, and which he found himself thinking about more carefully after those conversations. She had gone to a Comanche trading camp with her father as a child, she told him, and the memory had stayed with her, the ordinary humanness of it, the families and the commerce and the beauty of the work, and then the contrast of what had happened to those communities in the years since. They talked about her mother and his mother, and what it meant to be raised by women who gave everything. They talked about what they wanted their lives to look like 5 years from now, 10 years, which was the most future-oriented conversation August had had with anyone in a long time, because he had spent most of his adult life living in the present tense of emergency and problem and response. What he wanted, he discovered by saying it aloud to her at the kitchen table one November morning, was what he had already somehow been building without entirely realizing it. The daily return to the same place, the same face, the particular pleasure of knowing a person well enough that you could tell from the set of their shoulders whether the morning had been hard or easy. The sense that his life was constructing itself around something permanent rather than simply continuing forward into the next problem. She had listened to this with the focused attention she gave everything and then said, "That is exactly what you're already doing." "I know," he said. "Is that too obvious?" She asked, not with anxiety but with genuine curiosity. "Nothing about you is too obvious," he said. She smiled at him. A full, real smile, which was different from the corner-of-mouth curves she usually allowed herself, and it rearranged everything in his chest. He asked her to marry him on a Thursday afternoon in December, 6 weeks before Christmas, which in 1882 Texas was less about the season and more about the practical fact that winter was the slowest time for a farm and the easiest time to make arrangements. He did not make it into a production because he understood that productions were not her natural habitat. He asked her at the kitchen table, over coffee, looking directly at her. "Violet Hayes," he said, "I would like very much to spend the rest of my life bringing you cornbread and helping with the fence posts and listening to you talk. I think you're the most extraordinary person I've ever known, and I think you've only just started to see what you're capable of, and I want to be there for all of it." He paused. "Will you marry me?" She looked at him for a long moment. He could see her processing it, the way she processed everything, carefully and honestly, not performing anything. "Yes," she said. He exhaled. She must have seen something in the exhale, some release of the tension he had been holding, because she looked at him with that slight softening. "Were you worried I'd say no?" she asked. "A little," he admitted. "You have a previous record of pointing firearms at me." She laughed, and he reached across the table and took her hand, and she let him hold it, and it was everything. They were married in February of 1883, which was late enough in the winter that a few early wildflowers had appeared along the road to town, yellow and stubborn and small. The Reverend Giles performed the ceremony in the small Methodist church on Redrock's Main Street, which was as full as it could manage, because the town had, in the way of small towns, adopted Violet Hayes with the particular proprietary warmth of people who had watched from a distance and decided the right thing had happened. Cord Macy cried. He denied it afterward with considerable energy, but 3 separate people had witnessed it. Emmett Corder, Warren's cousin and no friend of Warren's, was in attendance and brought a jar of good honey as a wedding gift with a note that said, "From someone who knew your mother and is glad you stayed." Violet carried the note back to the farm and put it with the ledger book where the recipe lived. Warren Corder filed a water rights claim with the county land office in January, which August had anticipated, and which Violet's father's documented agreements handled with clean efficiency. The registrar found in Violet's favor. Corder's lawyer sent 2 letters afterward that were strongly worded and then nothing further. The matter, like most matters that ran up against sufficient preparation and documented truth, dissolved. August moved his belongings from the room he had rented above the hotel in Redrock to the Hayes farm, which had been his home in all practical terms for months already. He kept his office in Redrock, and the 8-mile ride became the shape of his working days, which was a long commute by any measure but which he found he did not mind in the slightest, because it was the ride toward and the ride home from, and both of those had a direction now. The farm changed under their combined attention in ways that were both practical and deeply personal. They painted the porch in the spring, a warm cream color that Violet had seen in a magazine, and pointed to with the tentative gesture of someone who was still learning to want things for herself. August bought the paint from the next lumber shipment. They painted it together on a Saturday afternoon, and it was both much harder than expected and considerably more enjoyable. And when they finished and stood back to look at it, Violet said, "My mother would have painted it years ago," which August heard as both grief and something adjacent to peace. They bought 6 head of cattle in March, a modest and manageable number, and Violet taught August cattle management with the patient expertise of someone who had been doing it since childhood. He was not a natural rancher, which amused her considerably. He was very good at the fence and very poor at reading cattle temperament, which was, Violet informed him with straight-faced sincerity, a more specialized skill than it looked. "She hates you," Violet said of the lead cow, a broad and determined animal August had privately named Nemesis. "She doesn't hate me," he said. "She has tried to step on you 3 times today," Violet said. "She's establishing hierarchy," he said. "She's stepping on you," Violet said. He got better at it. Not excellent, but competent, which was all he had ever aimed for in areas that were not his primary gift. On an evening in late April, 4 months after the wedding, they sat on the cream-colored porch as the sun went down, and August had his arm around Violet's shoulders, and she had her head tilted slightly toward him in the easy way of people who have learned the geography of another person, and she said, "I want to tell you something, and I'm not sure how to say it." "Try the direct approach," he said. "It's usually yours." She looked up at him. "I'm expecting," she said. The Texas sky went very wide and very quiet around them. He looked at her face, which was entirely open in the way it rarely was, all the careful management gone, just her, uncertain and waiting. He pulled her closer, and she pressed her forehead to his jaw, and he felt her exhale against his neck, and he held her in the cooling evening air and thought about the extraordinary reach of one moment forward into another, the honey recipe in the margin of the account book, the cornbread on the porch step, the fence posts, all of it reaching forward to this. "Are you happy?" she asked, against his shoulder. "I am the happiest I have ever been in my life," he said, and felt her take another long breath and let it out. "Good," she said. "So am I." A pause. "I didn't know I could be. I'd rather forgotten what it felt like." "You remembered," he said. "We remembered," she said. Their son was born in December of 1883, which Cord Macy announced to the entire office with a volume that was entirely disproportionate to the need. August had ridden back from Redrock to the farm the moment the midwife had sent word, and he arrived to find Violet exhausted and dignified and holding a dark-haired, furiously alert infant with the focused attention she gave everything. They named him Martin James Lockhart, Martin for her father, James for August's. The double weight of fathers ran through the name like a current, the acknowledgement that you carry the people who made you even as you make something new. Martin Hayes, wherever he was, would have found this acceptable, August thought, practical and properly documented and running toward the future. Violet recovered from the birth with the same combination of stubbornness and competence she brought to everything. She was up and managing the household within 2 weeks, which the midwife declared reckless and Violet declared necessary, and which August navigated by being present and useful without attempting to override her judgment, which he had learned by now was the correct approach to virtually all things involving Violet. Young Martin was a loud and opinionated infant who grew into a loud and opinionated toddler with his mother's gray eyes and his father's tendency toward decisive action, which combination promised an interesting future and kept both parents in a state of affectionate vigilance. The farm expanded quietly over the following years. More cattle in the spring of 1885. A new chicken coop that August built himself over 3 weekends with only moderate assistance from Cord Macy, and only 2 significant structural miscalculations that Violet identified and corrected without comment. A kitchen garden that became Violet's particular domain, and that she approached with the same systematic intelligence she brought to everything, studying seed catalogs over winter evenings, and planning with a thoroughness that August found entirely characteristic. She began baking honey cornbread for the Sunday service at Reverend Giles's church. It had started as a single contribution, brought once on an impulse, and had become a standing expectation that she managed without complaint and with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has found the right use for something that mattered. Mrs. Delgado at the hotel told her that Eleanor Hayes had also brought food to the Sunday service, different dishes but the same impulse, and Violet sat with that for a while, and then said to August that evening that she thought there were ways that love moved forward through time that were more complicated than simple inheritance. He agreed. He had been thinking about that for a long time. In the spring of 1886, Violet found out she was expecting again. This one came harder than the first several months difficult in ways the first pregnancy had not been, and August made the 8-mile ride every evening regardless of the work that piled up in his absence, because being home was not a choice he reconsidered on difficult days. It was simply where he was going. Their daughter was born in November of 1886. They named her Eleanor Rose Lockhart, and she was small and certain from the first moment, with the particular quality of someone who has opinions about their circumstances and intends to make them known. Violet held her in the November lamplight and looked at her with an expression August had never seen on her face before, something that was entirely specific to this child and this moment. "Eleanor," Violet said softly. "Hello." Martin, who was nearly 3 and had strong feelings about sharing his parents' attention, was brought in to meet his sister by August and immediately attempted to give her his favorite wooden horse, which was either generosity or an opening negotiating position and probably both. "That's a big gift," August told him. "She can have it," Martin said, with the magnanimous air of someone who has just discovered he can afford to be generous. The wooden horse lived in Eleanor's cradle for a week before Martin quietly retrieved it, which everyone pretended not to notice. The years built themselves with the particular satisfaction of years that are being properly used. August was re-elected sheriff of Crockett County in 1884 and again in 1888, which was by then something Crockett County did without much deliberation, the way you kept doing something that worked. Cord Macy became his chief deputy in 1886 and was himself elected town marshal of a neighboring settlement in 1889, which August celebrated with genuine pride, and only a moderate amount of nostalgia for the young man who had first knocked without knocking and reported on a widow he'd never met. Warren Corder died in 1887 of a stroke, which ended any remaining dispute regarding the water rights in a permanent and efficient manner. His son, a young man of 20 who had inherited his father's property but not his father's combative relationship with the Hayeses, came to the farm one afternoon to introduce himself and to say, with the straightforward decency of someone who has grown up watching their father's worst behavior and decided on a different approach, that he hoped they could be neighbors in the proper sense. They could. They were. The farm in 1890 was not the dying, desperate thing August had ridden up to in 1882. The east fence was on its 3rd set of posts by now, properly maintained. The herd had grown to 22 head of cattle. The chicken coop had been expanded twice. The cream-colored porch had been repainted once, the same color, because neither of them saw any reason to change a thing that was right. On a morning in the September of 1890, 8 years after the afternoon August had sat on the porch step with a piece of cornbread and refused to leave, he rode in from Raydrock to find Violet in the kitchen, Martin at the table working on his letters with the laborious concentration of a 6-year-old, who is deeply unconvinced that handwriting is worth the effort, and Eleanor asleep in the corner cradle that was getting too small for her. Violet looked up when he came in and poured him coffee without being asked, because she knew exactly when he arrived and exactly what he needed, the way you know these things when someone has been the geography of your daily life for 7 years. He sat down and drank the coffee and watched his son wrestle with the letter G and his daughter sleep with her characteristic certainty, and he looked at his wife across the table, who was looking at him with the full, complicated, layered attention that had never changed, the gray eyes that he had been reading for 7 years and that still occasionally surprised him with something new. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. "How are you?" he asked, because he always asked and always meant it. "Very well," she said, and then she looked at him with a particular quality to her expression that he had learned to recognize. "I need to tell you something." He set down the coffee. Martin looked up from the letter G with the instinctive alertness of a child who has learned that when both parents go quiet simultaneously it usually means news. "A third one," August said. "A third one," she confirmed. Martin abandoned the letter G entirely and wanted to know if it would be a horse, which was his preferred solution to most questions at this stage of his development. "Not a horse," August told him. "A brother," Martin said, with the firmness of a boy who knew what he wanted. "We'll see," Violet said, with the serenity of a woman who had made her peace with all outcomes. It was a boy. They named him Samuel William Lockhart, for no ancestor in particular, and for the simple reason that it was the name that seemed right when they looked at him, which was, August had come to believe, a perfectly sufficient reason for any important decision. Samuel was calmer than his older siblings, which Martin interpreted as a character flaw and Alina interpreted as a personal insult, neither of them being particularly calm children. But he was also deeply observant, a quality August recognized, and that Violet said was clearly from her side of things. And he grew up with that particular quality of seeing people clearly that usually means either a lawman or a healer, or someone very specific to themselves. The life they built was ordinary in all the ways that mattered and extraordinary in the way that the ordinary, when it is chosen and tended and honest, always is. Years later, when Alina was old enough to ask the question that children of a certain age always eventually asked, which was how her parents had met, August and Violet looked at each other across the kitchen table with the look of people who share something that has acquired a long private history. "Your father," Violet told Alina, "came to the farm when I was in a very bad way and sat himself down on the porch step without being invited and refused to leave." "Why?" Alina asked. "Because he brought cornbread," Violet said. "That doesn't explain why he didn't leave," Alina said. She was 9 and logical. "He was very stubborn," Violet said. "He kept saying he wasn't leaving until I agreed to eat something." Alina looked at her father with the specific expression of a 9-year-old conducting an assessment. "Was she very difficult?" "She pointed a gun at me," August said. Alina seemed to find this appropriate. "Did she shoot you?" "She did not," he said. "I considered it," Violet said. "She considered it," he confirmed. Alina looked between them. "And then you fell in love because of the cornbread." "Not only the cornbread," Violet said. "He also fixed the fence." "I mostly helped with the fence," August said. "Your mother did most of the actual knowing what to do." Violet looked at him. The gray eyes, which were the same eyes they had always been, perhaps even more complicated now with all the years that had accumulated behind them, looked at him with everything that 9 years of mornings and evenings and honey cornbread and fence posts and 3 children and 1 painted porch had built between them. "He refused to leave," she told Alina simply. "And eventually I was very glad he stayed." Martin, who was 13 by then and trying to pretend he wasn't listening, was very clearly listening. Samuel, who was 3, had fallen asleep against August's arm with the completeness of children who believe absolutely in their own safety. August looked at the kitchen. The table that had been there when he first sat down at it, brought inside from the cold, invited by a woman who did not yet know how to let herself be helped. The window where the 2 copies of Jane Eyre still stood, the old one and the new one, together on the same sill. The ledger book in the bedroom wardrobe where the honey cornbread recipe lived in Alina Hayes's small, hurrying handwriting. He looked at Violet, who was looking at Alina, who was looking at everything with the wide attention of a child who is collecting the story of where she came from. "Yes," he said quietly, though no one had asked him anything just then. "I'm very glad I stayed." Violet turned to look at him. The familiar look, the one that was worth every 8-mile ride, every cold morning on a porch step, every careful, patient day of being consistently present. "You were very stubborn about it," she said. "I've been told that about myself," he said. "It turned out to be a useful quality," she said. "In this specific instance," he said, "yes." She reached across the sleeping Samuel and put her hand over his, the way she had begun doing years ago and had never stopped, with the same naturalness as breathing, as though the gesture had simply always been the obvious thing. "In many instances," she said. Outside, the Texas October was doing what October did out here, pulling the heat out of the land and leaving behind a clarity of sky and light that belonged only to this season, this place. The fence stood clean and straight along the east property line, the 5th set of posts now, properly set. The cattle moved in the middle pasture. The chicken coop was quiet in the afternoon warmth. The porch was cream-colored and solid, and the steps were the same steps he had sat on that first evening. eating salt pork in the dark, listening to the coyotes talk to the stars, waiting for a woman who needed someone to wait without asking her to be anything other than what she was. He had been very stubborn about it. He had never once regretted it. And Violet Hayes, who was now Violet Lockhart, who had learned slowly and with great difficulty and enormous grace how to need someone and be needed in return, who made honey cornbread every Sunday and kept her mother's recipe in the old ledger and her father's name in her oldest son's, and who rode the fence line in October with her husband beside her and their children trailing behind with varying degrees of enthusiasm, looked at the life she had built from the nearly nothing of a dying October afternoon and found it extraordinary. Not because it was large. It wasn't large. It was a farm in South Texas with 22 head of cattle and 3 children and a sheriff who could not manage the lead cow. But it was true. Every piece of it was true and tended and chosen, and that, she had come to understand, was what extraordinary actually meant when you stripped away all the dramatic versions of the word. It meant this: the coffee on the table, the hand over the hand, the man who came back every morning. It meant staying. It always had.